It was a regular Tuesday night when I showed up for my shift at the old Millstone factory. This place had been standing for decades, and you could feel every single year in the creaky floors and the cold drafts that slipped through the cracks in the walls. I had worked here for almost 6 months, and no matter how many nights I spent in that place, I never really got used to it. The factory had a vibe, you know? One of those places where the silence feels heavy, like the building's holding its breath. But hey, a job's a job, and at this point, I couldn't afford to be picky. I parked my car outside and took a deep breath before stepping out into the chilly night air. The wind howled a little, rattling the old metal gate as I walked toward the entrance. Jimmy, the guy who worked the day shift, was waiting for me by the door, jingling the keys in his hand like he always did. "Yo, Tony, don't fall asleep like last time, all right?" Jimmy said, smirking as he passed me the keys. His laugh was light, but there was something about the way he said it that rubbed me the wrong way. He had been teasing me ever since I dozed off that one time a few weeks ago. Just a quick nap, nothing serious. But the way he told it, you'd think I had slept through a whole tornado. Yeah, real funny, Jimmy. Just go home, man. I got this, I replied, shaking my head. I tried to play it cool, but deep down, the joke bugged me. Jimmy chuckled and gave me a slap on the shoulder. "Allericht, Mann. See you tomorrow. Don't let the place eat you alive," he said before heading off to his car, still laughing. I watched him drive away before turning back toward the factory. The building loomed over me, dark and silent except for the faint hum of the security lights. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. I let out a sigh and stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a loud thunk. That sound always made me feel like I was being locked in for the night, like I was trapped in there until morning. I did my usual routine, grabbed my flashlight from the desk, logged into the security system, and made a quick scan of the camera feeds. Everything looked normal. Well, as normal as it could be in this place. The cameras showed the same dimly lit rooms, the same empty hallways. No movement, no signs of anything out of place. Just the way I liked it. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be different. There was something in the air, something off. I tried to push it out of my mind as I started my first round of the night, heading down the long hallway that led to the break room. My footsteps echoed softly in the silence, and every now and then, I'd catch the faint squeak of a rat scurrying by. Those little bastards were everywhere in this place. I flicked my flashlight on as I passed through the break room. The old vending machines stood in the corner, their lights flickering like they were ready to give up. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air, even though no one had brewed a pot in days. I glanced around. Everything seemed in order, and I kept moving. I was halfway down the next hallway when I felt that strange, uneasy feeling creeping up on me. I paused for a second, listening. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of the building's old machinery and the distant groan of the wind outside. But still, it felt like something was watching me. I turned, shining my flashlight down the hall behind me. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway. "Come on, Tony. You're just jumpy cause of Jimmy's stupid joke," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. I tried to laugh it off and kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. By the time I finished my first round, it was close to midnight. I returned to the security office, sat down in the old, squeaky chair, and checked the camera feeds again. Same thing, nothing moving, nothing out of place. But that heavy silence still hung in the air, thicker now. It was like the building was holding its breath, waiting. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion creeping in. Maybe Jimmy was right. Maybe I needed to cut back on the late-night coffee and actually get some real sleep during the day. But as I sat there, staring at the monitors, I couldn't help but wonder if something was out there, lurking just out of sight. I glanced at the door, half expecting to see it swing open on its own. But nothing happened. For now, the night dragged on, and after sitting in that chair for what felt like an eternity, I decided it was time to make another round. Staying in one place too long always made my imagination run wild, and in a place like Millstone, that was the last thing you wanted. So, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back out into the cold, empty halls. The factory had this weird layout, Lots of long, narrow corridors with random rooms scattered around like someone just added them on over the years without a plan. It made my rounds feel like a maze, even though I'd been walking the same paths for months now. The place was dimly lit, and half the time the old fluorescent lights flickered above me like they were about to die out at any second. Not that they were much help anyway. Most of the factory was still shrouded in shadows. I walked past the break room again, shining my flashlight inside just to be sure everything was still in place. Same flickering vending machines, same stale smell of old coffee. But then something caught my eye. The door to the room, asterisk, it was slightly open star. That was weird because I was sure I'd closed it earlier. I hesitated for a second, my hand tightening around the flashlight. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but there was something about this that didn't sit right with me. Maybe you just didn't close it all the way, Tony. No big deal, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little on edge. I pushed the door open with the end of my flashlight, just in case something or someone was inside. The room was empty, of course. Same old folding chairs, same dingy countertops. But still, I felt that weird tightness in my chest, like something was watching me. I stepped inside and did a quick sweep of the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The vending machines were still humming quietly in the corner, their dim lights casting strange shadows on the walls. I checked behind the counters, under the tables. Nothing. Just me, the rats, and a lot of dust. I shut the door behind me, this time making sure it clicked closed, and moved on with my rounds. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just a little bit off. It's like the air in the factory had changed, gotten heavier somehow. It felt thicker, like walking through water. And there was this faint smell, too. Something musty, like old wood mixed with damp concrete. Maybe it was always there, and I just hadn't noticed until now, but tonight, it felt stronger. As I made my way toward the storage area, I noticed how loud my footsteps sounded. The echo bounced off the walls, making it seem like there was someone else walking just behind me. I stopped suddenly, shining my flashlight behind me. Nothing. Just that same empty hallway, stretching back into the darkness. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and kept moving. The storage area was up ahead, a huge space filled with shelves stacked high with old equipment and boxes of random factory junk. Nobody really came down here except me. It was part of my rounds, but I never liked being in there. It was too quiet, too still. When I opened the door to the storage room, that heavy smell hit me again, only stronger this time. The place felt cold, colder than the rest of the factory, like all the heat had been sucked out. My flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long shadows over the rows of dusty shelves. Everything seemed fine, no boxes out of place, no signs of anything unusual. But as I walked deeper into the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I heard it, a thud, loud, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, like something heavy had fallen. My first thought was that maybe one of the old boxes had tipped over, but then again, none of them looked disturbed when I walked in. I slowly made my way toward the corner where the noise came from, my flashlight beam bouncing along the dusty floor. My footsteps were slow, deliberate. The silence in the room felt thick, pressing in on me. As I got closer, I could see the shelves were still standing. No boxes had fallen. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, there it was again, a soft thumping sound, this time coming from above me. I looked up, shining my flashlight on the ceiling. There, high above, were the old rafters, beams of wood crisscrossing above the storage room. But nothing was up there, just dust and shadows. Still, the sound came again. Asterisk thump. Thump asterisk, like something was moving across the beams, slow and deliberate. Is someone up there? I called out, my voice barely steady. No response. Just the faint creaking of the old wood. I waited for a few seconds, listening, but the noise had stopped. My heart was still pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a bird or something. The place had been abandoned for years before they reopened it, and there were always animals getting into weird places. Probably just a raccoon or something. I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I didn't really believe it. I stood there for a few moments longer, just staring up at the ceiling, half expecting something to come crawling out of the shadows. But nothing did. The noise had stopped, and everything was quiet again. I turned around and headed back toward the door, my footsteps echoing louder than before in the empty room. As I left the storage area, I glanced back one last time. The space felt different, like it was hiding something from me. But whatever it was, I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I made it back to the security office, feeling uneasy after that strange noise in the storage room. I tried to push the feeling down, telling myself it was probably nothing, just the wind or some animal wandering around in the old rafters. But deep down, something didn't sit right. I sat back in my chair, the old leather creaking under my weight, and glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. I flipped through the camera feeds again, hoping the familiar sight of empty rooms and hallways would calm my nerves. But there was something about those screens that only made me feel more on edge. The grainy footage flickered as I cycled through the different angles, showing nothing but dimly lit corridors and dusty factory floors. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That same heavy silence hung in the air, pressing down on me. I took a deep breath, leaned back, and rubbed my temples. "You're overthinking it, Tony," I said out loud, trying to calm myself. But the sound of my own voice only reminded me of how alone I was. No one else was here, just me, and whatever the hell that noise was. Suddenly, just as I was starting to settle in again, I heard it, a loud bang, echoing through the empty factory. It wasn't just some random thud like before. This was loud, like something heavy had been dropped, or maybe even knocked over. My heart jumped into my throat as I scrambled to check the camera feeds again. I flipped through them quickly, my fingers shaking slightly as I looked for anything out of place. But everything on the screen seemed normal. The same empty rooms, the same still shadows. Nothing was moving, but that noise had been real, no question about it. I stood up from the chair, grabbing my flashlight, and took a deep breath. I didn't really want to go check it out, but I didn't have much choice. It was part of the job. Whatever made that noise, I needed to figure it out. As I stepped out of the office, the sound of my boots hitting the floor felt too loud in the dead silence that had settled over the factory. The wind outside had died down, and the only noise I could hear was the faint hum of the building's ancient electrical system. I tried to calm my breathing as I made my way down the hallway, but my mind kept racing. What the hell could have made that noise? And why did it sound so close? I followed the sound toward the heart of the factory, where the big machines used to run back in the day. They hadn't been turned on in years, and most of them were rusting away under layers of dust and grime. As I got closer to the old assembly line, I could feel the temperature drop. The air was colder here, and there was a strange smell, like metal and something faintly rotten. I stopped in the middle of the room, shining my flashlight around. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of rusted conveyor belts, old tools scattered on the floor, and heavy metal machinery looming like forgotten monsters. Everything seemed still, quiet, but I knew what I had heard. As I moved the light around, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape near the far end of the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, focusing my flashlight in that direction. There, near one of the old machines, was a large metal tool chest. It had been knocked over, its contents scattered across the floor. Wrenches, screwdrivers, and bolts were everywhere, like someone or something had just dumped it out. I walked over, shining my light over the mess. The tool chest was heavy, no way it just tipped over on its own. I knelt down to inspect it, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe it had been leaning against something, and gravity finally took it down. But that didn't explain the noise. That bang had been too loud, too deliberate. I stood up and looked around, shining the light into the shadows, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was no one, just the same old machinery, the same cold air, and that eerie silence. I turned around, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just one of the old beams shifting, or a weak spot in the floor causing the chest to fall. But it didn't feel right. That's when I heard it again. Asterisk the footsteps star. They were soft, barely audible, but they were there. Slow and steady, coming from somewhere above me. I froze, shining my light up toward the ceiling. The rafters were high, dark, and crisscrossed with old wooden beams. My flashlight beam flickered as it swept across the ceiling, but I couldn't see anything up there. Still, the sound continued. Asterisk thump. Thump. Thump asterisk, like someone was walking above me, moving carefully. My pulse started racing, and I called out before I could stop myself. "Who's up there?" My voice echoed through the empty factory, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat on the back of my neck. There was no second floor above this part of the factory, just those rafters and the roof. But I had heard it, those unmistakable footsteps. For a moment, I considered going back to the security office, locking the door and waiting out the rest of my shift. Whatever was making that noise wasn't my problem. I could just file a report in the morning and let someone else deal with it. But part of me couldn't let it go. I had to know what was going on. I took a deep breath and started walking again, shining my light ahead of me. The sound of my footsteps felt painfully loud in the silence, but there was no turning back now. I had to figure out what was happening in this place. As I approached the far end of the room, the cold air seemed to grow even thicker, almost suffocating. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow, darting between the machines. I stopped in my tracks, straining my eyes to see through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the quiet, empty factory. And yet, I could still hear it, asterisk, that faint sound of breathing asterisk, coming from somewhere nearby. Standing there in the dark, with only the weak beam of my flashlight to cut through the shadows, my mind raced. The footsteps, the breathing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But I hadn't seen anyone. No signs of life except for those sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. My heart pounded in my chest as I made a decision I wasn't entirely sure about. I needed to check the upper level. Now, the upper level of the Millstone factory wasn't really in use anymore. It had been part of the old office area back in the day when this place was running full steam, but ever since it shut down, no one had any reason to go up there. It was just dusty old rooms and storage now. But I couldn't ignore those footsteps from earlier. Maybe I'd find something up there that could explain what I'd been hearing. I headed toward the old staircase at the far end of the building. The steps were narrow and creaky, made of metal that groaned under my weight as I ascended. The whole time, I could hear my breathing, louder now that the air felt heavier. With each step, the factory seemed to close in on me, the silence deepening, only broken by the occasional creak of the stairs. I reached the top and paused, shining my light down the long hallway. The upper floor was darker than the rest of the factory, barely lit by a few emergency lights that flickered weakly in the distance. The walls up here were lined with old wooden panels, cracked and faded from years of neglect. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of musty wood and old paper filled my nose. The silence was unnerving. I stood there for a moment, just listening, waiting for some kind of sound, anything that would let me know I wasn't imagining things. But it was dead quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the factory far below me, a distant reminder of how empty this place really was. I moved down the hallway slowly, my flashlight sweeping from side to side. Each step I took felt louder than it should have, the floorboards creaking under my boots. As I passed the old offices, I glanced inside the broken windows. Most of the rooms were empty, filled with dust and old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I kept moving, my senses on high alert. Halfway down the hall, I stopped. My flashlight flickered slightly, and there it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing just out of sight. My pulse quickened, and I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. I swallowed hard and moved forward, the sound of those footsteps growing louder in my ears. As I neared the end of the hall, I saw it, just a quick flicker of movement at the corner where the hall turned into another corridor. It was fast, like a shadow darting across the wall, too quick to make out any real details. I froze, my flashlight aimed at the spot where I'd seen the movement. For a moment, nothing happened. The hall was still, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I was starting to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, the door at the very end of the hall creaked open. Just a crack. The sound was so soft, so slow, that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like someone was watching me, waiting for me to come closer. I didn't want to, but at the same time, I couldn't just leave it alone. I had to know. I took a deep breath and walked toward the door, my flashlight flickering again as I approached. The air was colder here, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in just a few steps. My hand trembled as I reached out to push the door open. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a small, dark room. The light from my flashlight barely pierced the shadows, but I could see enough. The room was filled with old furniture, dusty chairs, a broken table, and piles of papers scattered across the floor. It looked like an office that had been abandoned in a hurry, left to rot over the years. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The room felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but the air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I swept the light across the floor, then up to the far wall, where a window looked out over the factory floor below. That's when I noticed something strange. The dust on the floor, there were streaks in it, like something had been dragged across the room recently. My chest tightened as I followed the marks with my flashlight. They led toward the corner of the room, where an old cabinet stood, half open. I moved closer, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight tighter. The cabinet was filled with old files and papers, but that wasn't what caught my attention. No, it was the fact that the cabinet door had been pulled open, and someone had been hiding behind it recently. The space between the wall and the cabinet was narrow, but just wide enough for someone to crouch behind. I stepped back, my throat dry. What the hell? I whispered under my breath, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang, and I jumped, spinning around to face it. My flashlight flickered wildly, the beam bouncing off the walls in a panic. I rushed to the door, grabbing the handle and yanking it open. The hallway outside was just as empty as before, but my nerves were shot. I could still hear the echo of the door slamming in my ears. I backed out of the room quickly, my flashlight shaking as I scanned the hallway for any signs of movement. Nothing. Just the same dark corridor stretching out in both directions. But now, the footsteps were back, louder this time, coming from above me. I looked up, shining my flashlight toward the ceiling, but all I could see were the wooden beams of the old rafters, barely visible in the darkness. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. There was no way anyone could be up there. The rafters couldn't hold a person's weight, not after all these years. But the footsteps, those steady, deliberate footsteps, they were real. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The silence had returned, but the tension in the air was still there, hanging over me like a thick fog. I needed to get out of here. Whatever was happening in this place, it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. I turned and hurried back down the hall, the old floorboards creaking under my feet as I rushed toward the stairs. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight, watching me as I made my way back to the safety of the lower floors. But as I descended the stairs, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing at the top, watching me go. But there was nothing there, just the empty, dark hallway. I hurried down the stairs, my heart still racing from whatever had just happened on the upper floor. My footsteps echoed off the metal steps, each one louder than the last, bouncing around in the heavy silence of the factory. The air down here felt a little warmer, but that eerie feeling followed me, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped for a second, trying to catch my breath. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I had seen, or thought I had seen. The flickering shadows, the open door, the strange noises. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt terrifyingly real. But the real question was, who or what had made those footsteps above me? The factory was supposed to be empty, but it felt like something was there with me, moving just out of sight. I flicked on my flashlight again and scanned the hallway. It was the same as always, long, narrow, and dimly lit by the occasional flickering overhead light. The factory's walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching out from every corner, deep and dark. I didn't want to linger in that hallway any longer than necessary, so I started walking back toward the main floor, toward the larger, more open space where I thought I might feel safer. But as I walked, that sense of being watched crept back in, stronger than before. I was halfway down the hall when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight beam shook as I swept it across the room, but there was nothing there. Just shadows as far as I could see, and the faint outlines of the factory's old, rusted equipment. But I knew I had seen something, some flicker of movement just beyond my line of sight. I stood still listening, my ears strained to pick up any sound, any indication that I wasn't alone. At first, there was nothing, just the soft hum of the factory's old electrical system and the distant creaks of the building settling in the night. And then there was again a whisper of movement, barely audible, like the sound of cloth brushing against the floor. I turned quickly, aiming my flashlight down the hall behind me. And that's when I saw it, a shadow, quick, darting across the far end of the hall, just outside the reach of my light. It was gone in a flash, but I'd seen enough to know it wasn't just my imagination. My pulse raced, and I backed up a few steps, gripping the flashlight tighter in my hand. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. It echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the distance. But there was no answer. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe my mind was playing games with me. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. There had been something there, someone there, moving through the shadows watching me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep walking. Faster now, my footsteps echoing louder in the empty halls. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and the flashlight felt too small, too weak to fight off the darkness that seemed to be closing in around me. I made it to the main factory floor, and for a moment, the vast open space felt like a relief. The high ceilings, the old machines, and the rows of assembly lines stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by the emergency lights overhead. The air was thick with the smell of rust and oil, the machinery long dormant and covered in dust. But then I saw it again. At the far end of the factory floor, near one of the massive, rusted machines, a shadow moved. This time, it wasn't just a flicker in the corner of my eye. It was clear, deliberate. A tall, dark shape, shifting through the machinery like it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, shining my flashlight in its direction. The beam of light swept across the floor, illuminating the empty space, the rusted metal, and the layers of dust. But the shadow was gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where I had seen it, my hands trembling. The silence around me was almost deafening now, like the factory itself was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get the hell out of there, but another part of me, the part that had taken this job, that had shrugged off Jimmy's warnings, wanted to find out what was really happening. I stepped forward, cautiously, moving toward the far end of the factory where the shadow had been. My flashlight beam flickered slightly as I moved, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor. Every creak of the building felt magnified. Every sound seemed like it was coming from just behind me. As I neared the old machine where the shadow had disappeared, I slowed down, listening for any sign of movement. The factory was silent again, but the air felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I stepped around the corner of the machine, my flashlight aimed straight ahead. The space was empty. No one was there, just the rusted, broken-down equipment and the dust that had settled over everything. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the flashlight for a moment, trying to convince myself that I had just imagined it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A dark shape, low to the ground, moving between the machines. It was quick, darting out of sight before I could even fully register what it was. I turned, my heart in my throat, and aimed the flashlight in that direction. "Who's there?" I called out again, louder this time, the fear creeping into my voice. No answer. Just the quiet hum of the factory and the distant creak of metal shifting in the darkness. I took a step forward, shining my light into the space between the machines. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it, a dark, human-shaped figure, crouched low to the ground, its form blending almost seamlessly into the shadows. I could barely make out any details, but the way it moved, the way it shifted when the light hit it, it wasn't natural. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back. The figure didn't move. It just crouched there, staring at me like it was waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me as I bolted across the factory floor. My footsteps echoed loudly in the vast space, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get away, to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. As I ran, I could feel it behind me, hear the faint sound of footsteps chasing me through the darkness. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I reached the hallway and skidded to a stop, throwing myself through the doorway and slamming it shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, panting, my back pressed against the door, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The factory was silent again. But I knew deep down that whatever that thing was, it hadn't gone away. It was still there, watching, waiting. I was standing just outside the main assembly room, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled into my bones. I leaned against the cold wall, my mind racing with everything that had happened so far. The footsteps, the noises upstairs, the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was all swirling in my head, but I kept telling myself it had to be explainable. There had to be some rational explanation. Just as I started to pull myself together, everything went black. The lights flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the entire factory into darkness. The humming of the old fluorescent lights above me disappeared, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence in its place. For a split second, I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. I could barely see a thing, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. Damn it, I muttered under my breath. This place was ancient and power outages weren't exactly uncommon, but it had been months since anything like this happened. Usually, the backup generator kicked in almost immediately, but tonight there was nothing, just complete pitch-black silence. I took a deep breath and tightened my grip on the flashlight. I needed to get to the breaker room and check the backup generator. Maybe a fuse had blown or something had shorted out. But as I took a step forward, the sound returned. Not the usual hum of the factory, but something else. The faint echo of footsteps, far off but unmistakable. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. The footsteps were soft, barely audible, but they were there, coming from somewhere deep in the factory. It was like someone was moving through the shadows, just out of sight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking in the darkness. No response, just those quiet, deliberate footsteps getting closer. I didn't wait for another sound. I spun around and headed down the hallway, my flashlight flickering slightly as I moved. The beam of light seemed weak against the overwhelming darkness, barely cutting through the shadows that had swallowed the factory whole. As I made my way toward the breaker room, I could feel the cold air pressing down on me, thick and heavy. Every step I took echoed louder than usual, as if the walls themselves were amplifying the sound. I reached the door to the breaker room and hesitated for just a second before yanking it open. The door creaked loudly as it swung inward, and I stepped into the small, cramped space. The breaker panel was on the wall to my right, and the backup generator was in the far corner, a hulking machine that looked like it hadn't been serviced in years. I moved quickly to the breaker panel and flipped the switch, hoping the power would come back on. Nothing. I flipped it again. Still nothing. "Come on," I muttered, flipping the switch over and over again, but the factory remained dark. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as I turned to the generator. If the breaker wasn't the problem, then maybe the generator had failed. I crouched down in front of it, running my flashlight over the control panel. That's when I saw it. The generator hadn't failed. It had been turned off. The switch was flipped to the off position, something that couldn't have happened by accident. Someone had to physically be here in the factory and shut it down. My stomach dropped as I stared at the switch. My mind raced through the possibilities, trying to make sense of it. Maybe Jimmy had messed with it before he left. Maybe it was some kind of malfunction. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. I reached for the switch to turn the generator back on, but just as my fingers brushed the panel, I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my hand hovering over the switch. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was so close, like whoever had spoken was standing right behind me. My skin crawled, and every instinct I had told me not to turn around. But I had to. I slowly turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I swept the beam across the small room. There was no one there. The room was empty, just the same old shelves, dusty tools, and boxes stacked against the walls. But the voice, it had been real. I knew it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I took a step back, nearly stumbling over my own feet. I flicked the generator switch, and it sputtered to life, the low hum of the machine filling the room. The factory lights flickered back on, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. But the feeling didn't go away. Even with the lights back on, the factory felt wrong. The air was still thick with that strange, heavy presence. I stepped out of the breaker room and into the hallway, but the bright lights did nothing to calm my nerves. Every corner seemed darker than it should have been, every sound louder and more distorted. The silence that had filled the factory was gone, replaced by the faint hum of machinery and the constant feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I moved quickly down the hallway, eager to get back to the security office where I could check the cameras again. Maybe I'd see something, some kind of explanation for what was going on. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. As I turned the corner, heading toward the office, the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, faster, like whoever was making them was following me, closing the distance. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just ran. By the time I reached the security office, I was out of breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys to unlock the door. I stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. I rushed to the desk and pulled up the camera feeds on the monitors. The grainy footage flickered to life, showing the same empty hallways, the same still rooms. But there on one of the screens near the entrance of the factory, I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still, almost blending into the shadows. I leaned in closer, squinting at the monitor. The figure was tall, its features blurry and indistinct. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. I tried to zoom in, but the image distorted even more, the pixels breaking apart into a mess of static. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. Who or what was that? Suddenly, the camera feed cut out, the screen going black. The camera feed flickered out, leaving me staring at a black screen. My heart was racing, and the silence in the room felt suffocating. I could barely believe what I had just seen. That shadowy figure, what was it? Or who was it? I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The way it just stood there, motionless, almost blending into the darkness, had been unsettling enough, but the way the camera had cut out the moment I tried to get a better look, it was like the factory itself was working against me. I shook my head, trying to think clearly. I couldn't just sit here, staring at a dead screen. I needed to get the cameras back online, but more than that, I needed to know what was going on with the generator. If the power went out again, I didn't want to be caught in the dark. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight again, though I wasn't sure why I even needed it with the lights back on. Maybe it was just for a little extra comfort, like holding on to something solid in a storm. I took one last look at the dead monitors and headed out of the security office. The hallway felt different now, brighter, but somehow more oppressive. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a harsh white light that didn't do much to push back the sense of something lurking in the shadows. As I walked toward the generator room, my footsteps echoed down the long corridors, the sound magnified in the unnatural silence that clung to the place. When I reached the generator room, the door creaked as I pushed it open again. The low hum of the machine filled the small, cramped space, but it didn't give me the usual sense of relief it should have. The room still felt off, like the walls were pressing in on me. I walked over to the generator, running my fingers along the control panel, making sure everything was running as it should be. That's when I noticed something odd. The switch, the one that had been flipped off earlier, was now slightly loose. Not enough to notice at first glance, but enough to suggest it could easily be turned off again. I reached for it, running my thumb along the edge of the switch, and that's when I saw it. There were fingerprints on the panel. My stomach dropped. They were faint, like they had been made in a hurry, but they were unmistakable. Someone had been here. Recently. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. No one was supposed to be in the factory except me. Jimmy was long gone, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone else all night, except for those strange noises and footsteps. I swallowed hard and wiped my hand across my face, trying to calm down. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe the fingerprints were old, or maybe they were mine from earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The fingerprints were fresh, and that meant someone else had been in here, messing with the generator. I flipped the switch a few times, making sure it was secure, then stepped back from the panel. I didn't want to be in that room any longer than I had to. There was something about the way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, as if they were watching me. I left the generator room quickly, pulling the door shut behind me with more force than necessary. As I made my way back toward the main hallway, I heard it again, those damn footsteps. They were faint, almost like a whisper of sound, but they were coming from behind me, following me, matching my pace. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. For a few seconds, everything was silent. No footsteps, no creaking, just the faint hum of the factory's machinery. I turned around slowly, shining my flashlight down the hallway. Nothing. No one. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was there, just out of sight, watching me. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting around the factory as I moved. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder. I could feel the weight of the factory pressing down on me, like it was alive, like it knew I was there and didn't want me to leave. I reached the security office and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock, but I managed to get it secured. I took a deep breath and sat down at the desk, staring at the dead camera feeds again. I needed to figure out what was going on, but I didn't know where to start. That's when I noticed something on the desk. A small piece of paper, folded neatly in half, sitting in the middle of the desk where there hadn't been anything before. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. How had it gotten there? I hadn't left anything on the desk, and I sure as hell didn't remember putting it there. I reached for the paper, my hand trembling as I unfolded it. There was only one word written on it, in a shaky, scrawled handwriting that didn't look familiar. Leave. I stared at the word, my mind racing. Was this some kind of joke? A warning? Who had left it? My pulse quickened as I looked around the small office, suddenly feeling more trapped than ever. The door was still locked, and the windows were sealed, but the feeling that something or someone was inside with me wouldn't go away. The lights in the office flickered once, then twice, before going completely dark again. My heart dropped as the hum of the factory died with the power outage. The generator had failed. Again, I was left in total darkness, with only my flashlight and the deafening silence around me. And that's when I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak coming from just outside the door. Then another creak closer this time. I shone my flashlight toward the door, but the light felt weak against the oppressive blackness that had swallowed the room. The air was so thick with tension, I could barely breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound of footsteps filled the silence again, slow and deliberate. They stopped, right outside the door. I stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The knocks echoed through the room, loud and deliberate, sending a cold wave of fear coursing through my veins. I stood there, frozen, my back pressed against the desk, clutching my flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing added up. The generator, the shadowy figure on the camera, the paper with the single word, "Leave," it was all too much. The knocking had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was even worse. I could feel the weight of the factory pressing down on me, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to grow thicker, darker. The air was cold, too cold, and I could hear my own ragged breathing filling the void. I had no idea what was behind that door, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and slowly, carefully, took a step toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Part of me wanted to rip the door open and confront whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The other part of me wanted to barricade myself in the office and wait until daylight, hoping that whatever was out there would disappear with the sun. But I knew I couldn't just stand there forever. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. I stepped out of the security office, my flashlight sweeping over the familiar walls and floor. Everything looked the same, but the feeling in the air was different, heavier, almost suffocating. The factory, once just an old, creaky building, now felt like it was alive, like it was watching me, waiting. I took a few cautious steps down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Every shadow seemed to stretch out toward me, reaching with invisible fingers. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had to fight the urge to turn around and run. Something was wrong with this place, something deeper than just a faulty generator and some strange noises. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from behind me from the direction of the security office. I spun around, shining my flashlight back down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office, the door slightly ajar. The whisper had stopped, but the cold, gnawing fear in my gut told me it hadn't gone away. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to decide what to do next. That's when I saw it. The same shadowy figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was the same as before, tall, motionless, blending into the darkness like it was part of the factory itself. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hands. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I felt like a rabbit caught in a trap, frozen in place, waiting for the predator to pounce. The figure's presence was overwhelming, like the very air around it was warped and twisted by its existence. But then something strange happened. The lights flickered again, and for just a second, the figure seemed to shift. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't something inhuman. It looked like a person, a man. My heart skipped a beat. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. That figure, it wasn't some kind of ghost or monster. It was someone, or at least something that looked like someone. But who? And why were they here, in this old, abandoned factory? I took a step forward, my flashlight beam fixed on the figure. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking but steady enough. "What do you want?" No response. The figure remained still, watching. I took another step, and then another. My mind raced as I got closer. Was this all a trick? Some kind of setup? Maybe Jimmy had played a prank on me. Maybe this whole thing was some sick joke to get back at me for falling asleep on the job a few weeks ago. But then the lights flickered again, and the figure disappeared. Gone. Just like that. I stopped in my tracks, shining my flashlight frantically around the hallway. There was no way it could have just vanished like that. It had been right there, clear as day, and now it was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it, but nothing made sense anymore. And then I heard the whisper again. This time it was clearer, louder. It wasn't just a random sound. It was a voice. Tony. My blood ran cold. How did it know my name? I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to pulse around me, shifting with every movement of my flashlight. I took a step back, feeling the panic rising in my chest. "Tony," the voice said again, this time from behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight sweeping over the hallway. Nothing. No one. "Leave." The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was loud, clear, and filled with something dark, something malicious. It was like the factory itself was speaking to me, demanding that I leave before it was too late. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps pounding against the floor as I sprinted toward the exit. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart racing as I fought to keep the flashlight steady in my hand. The hallway stretched out before me, seemingly endless, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I reached the main floor, the vast emptiness of the factory floor spreading out before me like a dark, yawning chasm. The old machines stood like silent sentinels, their rusted forms casting long, jagged shadows across the concrete. The air was thick with dust and the smell of metal, and I could hear the faint hum of the generator still running somewhere in the background. But none of that mattered. All I cared about was getting out. I bolted for the main entrance, my eyes locked on the door at the far end of the factory. The exit sign above it glowed faintly in the darkness, like a beacon of hope in this nightmare. My legs burned as I ran, but I didn't care. I had to get out. But just as I reached the door, just as my hand grasped the cold metal handle, I heard it one last time. Tony, it was right behind me. I yanked the door open and stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I ran until I couldn't hear the voice anymore, until the factory was nothing but a dark silhouette against the starless sky. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the shadows. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stared at the factory through the windshield. The engine was running, but I hadn't moved. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The voice, the figure, the footsteps, my name being whispered over and over again. It had felt so real, so close. But now, sitting in the relative safety of my car, I started to wonder if my mind had been playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the stress of the job, the isolation of working alone at night in that creepy old building. Maybe I was just tired. I hadn't slept well for days. Could exhaustion explain all of this? But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That place, the Millstone Factory, there was something wrong with it. Something dark. And whatever it was, it had been trying to warn me. The figure, the voice telling me to leave, it wasn't just trying to scare me off. It was trying to protect me. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 3:30 a.m. My shift wasn't technically over for another few hours, but there was no way I was going back in there. I didn't care if I lost the job. I'd rather be unemployed than face whatever was lurking in those shadows again. I put the car in gear, ready to drive away, but something stopped me, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I had to know what was really going on in that factory. There had to be an explanation. I couldn't just leave it like this, haunted by the mystery of it all. I needed answers. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone. Maybe Jimmy would know something. He'd been working there longer than I had, and he was always joking about how creepy the place was. But what if it wasn't a joke? What if he knew more than he was letting on? I scrolled through my contacts and dialed Jimmy's number. It rang a few times before he picked up, his voice groggy. Tony? What the hell, man? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? He mumbled. I hesitated for a second, trying to find the right words. Jimmy, there's something going on at the factory. Something weird. Have you ever seen or heard anything strange while you were there? There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Jimmy shifting around, as if he was suddenly wide awake. Strange? What do you mean, strange? He asked, his tone now serious. I mean noises, footsteps, voices. I swear to God, Jimmy, I saw someone in there tonight. Some kind of figure just standing there in the shadows. And then the voice. It knew my name. There was another long pause. Jimmy didn't say anything for a while, and for a moment, I thought he was going to laugh it off like he always did. But then he spoke again, his voice low and cautious. Look, Tony, I wasn't going to tell you this because I figured it was just old rumors. Stories the guys would tell to mess with the new hires. But there's something you should know about that place. My heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? The Millstone Factory. It wasn't always just a factory. Back in the 70s, before it shut down the first time, there was an accident. A bad one. A fire broke out in the middle of the night, and one of the night guards got trapped inside. They couldn't save him. By the time they found him, it was too late. His body was burned pretty bad, but the thing is, they never figured out how the fire started. Some people say it wasn't an accident. Some say it was something else. Something unnatural. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, unnatural? There's a reason no one stays on as the night guard there for long, Jimmy continued. Everyone who's worked that shift has had experiences. Hearing voices. Seeing things that aren't there. I don't know if it's the guy who died or if it's something else, but whatever it is, it doesn't like people being there at night. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what Jimmy was telling me. It all started to make sense. The figure, the footsteps, the strange feeling that something was always watching me. I had always assumed it was just the creepy atmosphere of the place, but now I wasn't so sure. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Because I didn't believe it, Jimmy replied. I've worked the day shift for years, and I've never had any problems. I thought it was just bullshit. But if you're saying you've seen something, maybe those stories were true. I sat there, staring out at the dark silhouette of the factory in the distance, a cold sweat creeping down my back. Everything Jimmy had said lined up too well with what I had experienced tonight. The factory wasn't just old and abandoned. It was haunted in a way I couldn't fully explain. I think you should quit, Jimmy said, breaking the silence. That place is not safe. Not for you. Not for anyone. Just walk away, man. It's not worth it. I wanted to take his advice. Every fiber of my being told me to drive away, never look back, and forget this nightmare ever happened. But there was something inside me that couldn't let go. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what or who was haunting that factory. I'll think about it, I muttered, hanging up before Jimmy could say anything else. I stared at the factory for what felt like hours, my thoughts racing. Finally, I made a decision. I needed to go back. Not tonight, not now, but I would come back. During the day, when the factory wasn't cloaked in darkness, and I wasn't the only one there. I'd find out more about the fire, about the man who had died, and what really happened in this place. I'd get to the bottom of it. But for now, I had to leave. I put the car in gear and drove away, the factory fading into the distance behind me. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever was inside that factory wasn't done with me yet. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear that voice. Tony. But this time, I didn't turn back. Not yet.